Hello, this is Professor Kuehn, and welcome back to Introduction to Astronomy at Wisconsin Lutheran College. Have you ever noticed how easy it is, on the one hand, to remember the date of Christmas, December 25th, but how difficult it is, on the other hand, to remember when Easter is going to be? That's because Easter falls on a different day just about every year. Why is that? Today, I want to talk about calendar construction and the problem of Easter. This is going to provide us with an opportunity to talk about the intersection of astronomy, mathematics, theology, and history. So let's get started. First of all, I want to talk about Christmas to get us warmed up. The question is, why do we celebrate the Incarnation, that is, the date of Jesus' birth, on December 25th? After all, that's not written in the Bible anywhere, so why do we celebrate it on that day? Well, the winter solstice fell on December 25th, according to the old Julian calendar. What's the Julian calendar? Well, that was the calendar that was introduced by Julius Caesar back in about 45 BC, before the birth of Christ. That's the date on which the winter solstice fell, the darkest day of the year. That is the day on which the sun is below the horizon for the longest amount of time. Now, according to the Venerable Bede, who I'm going to talk a bit more about in a moment, the Church Fathers chose the winter solstice, that is, the darkest day of the year, as a day on which they should celebrate the Incarnation, that is, when the light came into the world. They reasoned as follows. They said, wouldn't it be appropriate if on the darkest day of the year we celebrate the day when Jesus, the light of the world, brought light into the world? And so, if we celebrate the Incarnation on December 25th, every day after that gets more and more bright, longer and longer daylight, and that would have symbolic significance. So that was the day on which Christmas was chosen to be celebrated. It sounds sensible for symbolic reasons. The difficulty arose in about 1584 AD with the introduction of the Gregorian calendar that was implemented by papal bull, an edict of the Pope, around 1584 AD. And according to this new Gregorian calendar, which by the way is the calendar that we use today, according to this Gregorian calendar, the winter solstice now falls on December 21st instead of on December 25th. So the church was then faced with a difficulty. Do we continue to celebrate Christmas on December 25th, the date on which people are accustomed to celebrating it, and sever its relationship to the winter solstice, the darkest day of the year? Or do we move Christmas, the Incarnation, to December 21st and maintain this symbolic significance of the darkest day of the year when Christ comes into the world? It must have been a difficult decision. They decided to keep it on the date December 25th. And so the symbolic relationship between the winter solstice and Christ's Incarnation was severed at this time. Now, let's talk a little bit about the Venerable Bede. This is going to lead up to the discussion of the problem of Easter. Bede was born in 673 AD. He lived and worked in a monastery in a tiny island called Iona, off the coast of Scotland. He wrote a famous ecclesiastical or church history. He wrote much poetry, some liturgical works, books on grammar, and a book on the use of astronomy in constructing an accurate calendar. This book was called On the Reckoning of Time, was written in 723 AD, and among other things, it popularized the use of the term Anno Domini, which means the year of our Lord, in dating. The terminology Anno Domini was not instituted by Bede. It was conceived of by Dionysius several centuries earlier, but Bede popularized this in his book, his widely read book On the Reckoning of Time. And as I mentioned a moment ago, Bede also explained the allegorical meaning of the dates chosen for Christmas, that is the winter solstice. And by the way, once you choose December 25th, the winter solstice according to the Julian calendar, as the date of Christmas, that immediately sets the date for the Annunciation. So if you look at your liturgical calendar, you'll see that we celebrate the Annunciation on the vernal equinox, that is on March 25th, 9 months before Christmas. Also of significance is the celebration of the birth of John the Baptist. You might recall in the Bible where John says, speaking of Jesus, he must increase while I must decrease. So while Christ is going up, John the Baptist is going down. You might think about it that way. So it would only be sensible to celebrate the birthday of John the Baptist on the summer solstice. That is the brightest day of the year, after which the sunlight decreases. And once you've chosen that, then immediately one can celebrate the conception of John the Baptist 9 months before that on the autumnal equinox, September 25th, according to the Julian calendar once again. In addition, maybe I'll say a few other things about Bede. He had a network of monks who live in monasteries all around England, and they were kind of his research assistants. They would record the height of tides on various days of the year and send all of their data to Bede on the island of Iona, and he correlated the motion of the tides around England with the motion of the moon. So in chapter 29 of his book On the Reckoning of Time, he talks about this correlation between the moon and the tides. He also talks about the problem of Easter. So we'll be getting to that in a few moments, but before we do that, let me talk about some of the general problems with constructing a calendar. I have listed here some of the modern or contemporary measurements of the length of the year and the length of the month. So let me spend a few moments talking about this to illustrate the difficulty in constructing a calendar. As you're listening to me talk about this, you might just imagine if you could not go down to Target or Walmart or wherever and just buy a calendar. If you actually had to make a calendar yourself, how would you go about doing that? And the significance of the motion of the sun through the zodiac and the moon through the zodiac were the central features on which people historically have based the calendar. So what's the problem? Well, how do we define a year? First of all, if you say you want a calendar that's a year long, we have to understand what we mean by a year. Well, the year was historically defined as the amount of time it takes for the sun to travel through the entire zodiac. Remember, the sun rises and sets every day, traveling from east to west across the sky, but in addition to that, it has this progression through the zodiac. So if you were to take a snapshot of where the sun was in relation to the stars behind it on a particular day, at a particular time, let's say at noon, I know you can't see the stars at noon, but suppose you could see the stars that were residing behind the sun at noon on a particular day. If you did that day after day after day, you'll notice at noon the sun is in front of a different set of stars. That is because the sun is progressing in a west to east direction through the signs of the zodiac. How long does it take the sun to travel through all of the signs of the zodiac? Well, you can count the number of days, and unfortunately is not an exact integral number of days. It takes 365.2422 days for the sun to travel through the entire zodiac. So if you're looking at the figure on the right-hand side here, you might imagine that if the sun is in front of the constellation Aries on a particular day, and then you want to know how long it takes to go through all 12 signs of the zodiac and get back to the same position in Aries, it would take 365.25 days roughly. What about a month? One of the central features of a calendar is the month. Well, how do we describe what a month is? And it's important to note that there are two ways of describing a month. Let me take the second one first. This is perhaps the more obvious one, how long it takes the moon to go through all of its phases. You know, it goes through new moon, and then first quarter, half moon, and then a full moon, and then back to third quarter, that's another half moon, and then back to a new moon once again. Those are the phases of the moon. How long does it take to get through all of the phases of the moon? Well, that's called the lunar synodic month. It is 29.53059 days. That is, it's because it has to do with the position of the moon in the sky compared to the sun. If the moon is in the same part of the sky as the sun, it's a new moon because the sun is illuminating the back of the moon. And if the sun is in the opposite side of the sky, that is opposite signs of the zodiac, then it would be a full moon because the moon is illuminating the face of the moon that we can see. Again, that's called the lunar synodic month. It's 29.53 days. That's not the same as the lunar sidereal month. What does sidereal mean? Well, you might see a Latin word there, sideres, meaning stars. And so the lunar sidereal month is how long the moon takes to go through all the signs of the zodiac from our perspective here on Earth. that is 27.32 days. So if you were to look at the moon in the sky on a particular night, it's going to be residing in front of a certain set of constellations. Well, from night to night, it's going to drift through these constellations, and whereas the sun takes 365 days to go through all the constellations, the moon moves much more rapidly. It takes only 27.3 days for the moon to go through all the signs of the zodiac. Why is the lunar sidereal month different than the lunar synodic month? Well, because in the 27 days that the moon takes to go through all the signs of the zodiac, the sun by that time will have moved by an extra month through the zodiac, so it's going to take an extra couple of days for the moon to catch up to the sun, so to speak, and that's why the lunar month is 29.5 days, whereas the sidereal month is only 27.3 days. Hopefully I didn't go through that too quickly for you. I could draw some pictures later on for you in person, but maybe that'll give you a snapshot of the different ways of describing the month. Now, once we know the length of a month and the length of a year, we can then begin constructing a calendar. And we can do that based on cycles of the moon, or cycles of the sun, or some combination of those. If we use only the moon, it would be a lunar calendar. If we use only the sun, it would be a solar calendar. And if we use both, it would be a lunisolar calendar. So let's suppose that we wanted to make a solar calendar. Well, we could make the year, remember, the year is 365.2422 days, so we could make a year 365 days long if we wanted to. The problem is we would then have to add 1 day every 4 years, a leap day, so to speak, at the end of the year in order to accommodate that extra about quarter of a day. But then, if you do that, you still have, on the 4th year, it's going to be too long by about 45 minutes. So the numbers don't add up quite right. So we have to make further corrections in addition to adding this 1 day every 4 years. Now, before we talk specifically about the problem of Easter, which I'm working toward, let's talk a bit about some other ancient calendars. Let's talk about, first of all, the ancient Egyptian calendar. And I really should say calendars because their calendar evolved over time. They used a lunisolar calendar. That is a combination of the motion of the moon and the motion of the sun. It was organized around the lunar cycle, but they occasionally corrected this by the sun's position in the zodiac in order to prevent drift of the growing and flooding season throughout the year. Let me explain what I mean by that. So it's a lunar calendar in the sense that they used 1 month is 30 days. And they defined 1 year as being 12 months long. By doing some algebra, you see right away that that is 360 days. This is the way the year was organized in the most ancient Egyptian texts. However, it was also a solar calendar in the sense that the first month was placed near the autumnal equinox. This is when Sirius, the dog star, became visible rising in the east just before the sun. So this lunar calendar, which was organized around months, was itself placed so that the first month was around the time of the heliacal rising of Sirius, you might say, or the rising of Sirius near the sun. It's interesting to note that the most ancient of these Egyptian calendars had 360 days in them, and it seems that an argument could be made that 5 days were added later on. Also interesting is the fact that the Vedas, which are ancient Indian texts, have a 360-day year. Sumerian calendars of the 4000 BC use a 360-day year. Ancient Aztec calendars use a 360-day year. And it seems like, according to some authors, that in about the 8th century BC, many of these calendars were reformed from a 360-day calendar to a 365-day calendar. This raises an interesting question, whether they were all just rounding off to 360 days, were they just kind of erroneous, and then they decided to kind of correct it by 5 days, or did the length of the year actually change at some point in history? That's a very controversial kind of thing. There are some authors who say that happened, but I would say most mainstream astronomers would disagree with that. You can decide, I suppose, for yourself after going down that rabbit hole. Okay, Now let's talk about the Roman or Julian calendar. This is also a lunisolar calendar implemented by Julius Caesar. As I mentioned a little while ago, it was in 45 BC that he implemented this. It was a lunar calendar in the sense that there were 12 months. The months had either 29 or 30 or 31 days each, and there were 365 and 1/4 days per year. It was solar in the sense that the vernal equinox was fixed to March 25th. So as soon as there was the vernal equinox, we said, okay, this is March 25th, and then we go from months after there. The first month, as I mentioned, was placed near the vernal equinox. That means, so March would be your first month. By the way, you might be interested in thinking about this. Even with our calendar today, when do we add our extra day of the year? Our extra day during a leap year. Well, we add it at the end of February, right? So normally February is 28 days, but on a leap year, we make February 29 days. Have you ever wondered why we add that day at the end of February instead of, say, at the end of December? Well, because we're adding it at the end of the year if you consider March to be the first day of the year. Then February, as you go around, is the last day of the year, and so you're adding one day at the end of the year when you do it at the end of February. Also, maybe this is another way of thinking about this. Do you ever wonder why we name our months the way that we do? Well, think about September for a moment. September, sept meaning 7, right? Why do we call it September? Well, because it's the 7th month of the year if you start in March, right? March, April, May, June, July, August, September would be the 7th month. What about October? Oct meaning 8. Think about an octagon. It has 8 sides. It's the 8th month. November, novem meaning 9. And December or december meaning 10. It's the 10th month. So even the names of our months are pointing back to the time when March was the first month of the year. Okay, going back to this Roman Julian calendar, how did they go about counting their days based on the moon? Well, the calends of the month is the date on which the sighting of the new moon of that month occurs. That was called the calends. That's, by the way, where we get our word calendar. So the new moon appears, and they say, okay, this is the calends of March. And then one knows from past experience that the first quarter moon is coming up. That is, the half moon is coming up. So that is called the nones of the month. And according to the Romans, they began counting downward toward nones. After the calends, they said, oh, it's 4 nones, 3 nones, 2 nones, and then nones on the first quarter moon. So they're sort of anticipating the coming of the next phase of the moon. Rather than counting up, they're counting down. Now, after the first quarter, then they start looking forward to the full moon of the month. That would be the ides of the month. So 8 ides, 7 ides, 6 ides, and so on. And then finally, on the full moon, it is the ides of March. I couldn't resist but putting in a picture here of the assassination of Julius Caesar. You might recall, if you've read some of this literature, he was assassinated on the Ides of March. The soothsayer tells him to beware the Ides of March. Then, once it's a full moon, then you begin anticipating the new moon of the next month. So 19 calends of the next month, 18 calends of April, 17 calends of April, and so on, until you get to the new moon in April. That would be the calends of April, and then you begin looking forward to nones and ides and so on. The Julian calendar, as I mentioned, is 365 and 1/4 days per year. That means that it's going to slowly drift over time because they're not exactly 365 and 1/4 days per year. It's 365.2422 days per year. So the problem is that the Julian calendar begins drifting. It drifts by 1 day in about 128 years. It's kind of like when you have a wristwatch and it's off by 1 second. Let's say it loses 1 second every day. It's not a big deal for 1 day. But pretty soon, after 5 days, 10 days, a week, a month, it starts being off by 5, 10, 20 minutes or so. The same thing happens if the length of your year is off by just 6 hours or so. So in 1 day, you're off by 1 day in 128 years. And this is something that's important. To Bede, for example, he's working in about the 7th century AD, and they were using the Julian calendar, and these errors had been accumulating over time, and so the issue of calendrical reform is at the forefront of his mind. Now, let's talk for a few minutes about the Hebrew calendar. The Hebrew calendar, once again, is a lunisolar calendar. It's described in the Hebrew scriptures, the Old Testament. It's a lunar calendar in the sense that it's comprised of 12 months. By the way, this is based on inferences from Scripture itself. So, for example, you might look at the first book of Kings, chapter 4, where the 12 tribes of Israel had to each provide food for the king for 1 month. According to the Hebrew calendar, the first month is the month of Nisan, and it is placed near the vernal equinox. So in that sense, it's a solar calendar. The vernal equinox has to do with where the sun is in the zodiac. It's passing into the first point of Aries. So once that happens, then you say, well, this is the first month of the year, and then you begin using the moon to count off months. Each month began when the new moon is sighted at dusk. That is in the evening by a committee of the Sanhedrin in Jerusalem. So you might imagine the committee members going outside and looking for when the new moon is visible. On the day that the new moon is visible, they say, okay, this is the first day of Nisan, or the first day of the next month, and so on. According to the Hebrew calendar, months were 29 or 30 days long, and the year ended up being 11 days shorter than 365 days, according to the way they're counting off their months, according to the phases of the moon. So what did they do if it's 11 days shorter than 365 days? Well, they didn't just add in 11 days at the end. What they did is they waited for 3 years and let these errors accumulate for 3 years, and then they would add in an extra month. A leap month is inserted at the end of the year. That avoids a drift of the growing seasons through the calendar year. Now, let's talk a little bit more about the Hebrew calendar, specifically the Passover feast. You might remember the Passover feast. That's a celebration of when the Israelites got out of Egypt, were delivered from Egypt by Moses. And so the Jewish Passover feast was instructed, according to the scriptures, to be celebrated on the full moon in the month of Nisan. That is on the 14th day of Nisan. Because remember, the new moon is the first day of the month, so the full moon is 14 days later, the 14th day of Nisan. Now remember, the Hebrew calendar is about 11 days short every year, so they had to add a month every 3 years or so, and this was designed to keep Nisan and the Passover feast itself as a spring festival. So they wanted to keep Nisan as a spring festival, which commemorated their delivery from Egypt. Now, the decision, here's the problem. The decision as to whether to add a month on a particular year was made by a head rabbi who was watching for a new moon. And the impracticality of the system eventually led to tabulation or calculation rather than sighting of the new moon. You might imagine as the Jewish community spread, and they were trying to establish calendars so they know when to worship and when to conduct business and so on. As they're getting farther and farther away from Jerusalem, it becomes more and more difficult to wait for the head rabbi in Jerusalem to tell you when the new month begins, and then to disseminate that information across the different lands. So they started calculating and making these tables of when the new moon was going to be on a particular year. But as you imagine, if you're not really great at astronomy, then the calculations are not going to be very reliable. And this brings us to the issue of Easter and calculating Easter. So, at the time of Jesus' death and resurrection, the Christians decided after his resurrection to celebrate the Passion season, that is, the events leading up to the death and then the resurrection of Christ, during the Jewish season of Passover. After all, you might recall that Jesus celebrated the Passover just before his crucifixion. So Christians said, well, what we want to do is we want to link our celebration of the resurrection to the Jewish Passover feast. And the Jewish Passover feast, of course, happened on the 14th of Nisan every year. So they said, well, then Jesus died and was resurrected on Sunday, and so we want to celebrate our most sacred holiday 2 days after the 14th of Nisan. Now, you might imagine that this eventually ran into some difficulties because only the Jewish rabbis could say when Nisan begin. And so the question arose, should the Christians trust the Jewish congregation to schedule their most holy festival of the year? You might imagine, the Christians who are getting ready to celebrate Easter, they have to send somebody over to the Jewish synagogue who is not exactly friendly to the Christians to ask when Passover was going to be, so they would know when to celebrate Easter. And to say the least, there was quite some antipathy between the Jewish people and the fledgling Christian organizations. So what did the Christians do? They decided to start doing their own calculations of lunar and solar cycles. The Jewish calculations, as I mentioned a moment ago, were often quite poor, sometimes resulting in 2 Pascals or 2 Passovers in 1 year between successive equinoxes. So the Christians began doing calculations in order to know when the full moon after the vernal equinox would be, so that they would not have to rely on their Jewish counterparts to tell them when to celebrate their most holy festival of the year. The cycles of the sun and the moon would specify then when the 14th day of Christian Nisan would be celebrated using the Julian calendar. Now, this leads us to the Council of Nicaea and the Quartodeciman controversy. Here's the issue. Some of the Christians, for example St. Polycarp and Syrian Christians, continued to celebrate Easter 2 days after the Jewish specification of Nisan 14. So, the Jewish specification of Nisan 14, let's suppose they say the new moon after the vernal equinox, that is the 14th of Nisan, let's suppose it's celebrated on Monday. Well then, according to these Christians, these Syrian Christians for instance, we're going to celebrate Easter 2 days after that. That would be celebrating Easter on a Wednesday. Other Christians celebrated Easter on the Sunday after the Christian and Julian specification of Nisan 14, according to their calendar. So this led to some confusion among Christians. You had different Christians celebrating Easter on different days. Now this might not sound like a huge problem, but you might imagine if you're traveling to meet people to celebrate Easter together, this could cause problems. You might think, if you show up 10 or 15 minutes late to a church service, it's not a really big deal, but let's suppose you're traveling to celebrate Easter someplace and you show up 2 weeks or 3 weeks late. That becomes a bigger problem. So the Council of Nicaea, that's the same council that formulated the Nicene Creed, the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD formalized the date on which Easter would be celebrated. And here's the formula that they came up with. Easter will be celebrated on the first Sunday after the first full moon after the vernal equinox. Again, on the first Sunday after the first full moon after the vernal equinox. And so, subsequently, Christian astronomers began using churches as observatories to try to refine their calendars. So here you see a very strong interest in astronomy that's picked up by many Christian thinkers. In the next slide, what I show is an example of how a cathedral was used as a solar observatory in order to predict the date of the vernal equinox and hence Easter. In order to do this, one had to accurately measure the length of the solar year. How did they do this? Well, you see in this diagram what's called a meridian line. And the meridian line would be a line running in the north-south direction through the church. If one were to punch a hole in the southern wall of the church, the sun would travel across the floor of the church as the sun moved through the sky over the course of the day, and at local noon, the sun would pass across this meridian line. Now, it would pass across this meridian line at a different location on different days of the year. So when the sun was very low in the sky, let's say on the winter solstice, the sun would be very far down the meridian line and cross the meridian line. However, when the sun is very high in the sky on the summer solstice, the sun would travel across the floor and cross the meridian line very close to the southern wall of the church. And so by marking the different points at which the sun crosses the meridian line on different days of the year, one can specify which day of the year it is using this solar solar calendar. One could mark off various seasons of the church. One could mark off when Lent is and when Advent is, and so on.